He galloped across our screens as the iconic Lone Ranger for years. Brave, noble, unstoppable.
4 generations of television viewers, the masked hero known as the Lone Ranger represented justice, courage, and unwavering integrity. Riding across dusty landscapes with his faithful companion Tonto, the character became a symbol of hope during an era when television was beginning to shape popular culture in powerful new ways. Yet behind the iconic mask stood a man whose real life was far more complicated than the heroic figure he portrayed. That man was Clayton Moore, and while millions of fans knew him as a fearless rider who always did what was right, very few understood the personal journey that led him to become one of television's most unforgettable heroes. Long before the success of the Lone Ranger made him a household name, Clayton Moore was simply a young man searching for opportunity in an unpredictable industry. Like many aspiring actors of his generation, he arrived in Hollywood during a time when competition was fierce and the path to success was rarely clear. Early roles often came in small parts, sometimes uncredited, and actors had to prove themselves repeatedly before receiving meaningful recognition. Moore spent years navigating this environment, appearing in minor film roles and Western serials, slowly building the experience that would later shape his most famous performance. When the opportunity to portray the Lone Ranger arrived in the late 1940s, few could have predicted just how deeply the role would define Moore's life. The character had already gained popularity through radio programs, but bringing the story to television required an actor who could embody both strength and sincerity. Moore's calm presence, athletic ability, and natural sense of heroism made him a perfect fit. With a mask covering much of his face, he relied heavily on body language and voice to communicate emotion and conviction, transforming what might have been a simple action role into something that felt authentic and inspiring. That as the series gained popularity, audiences quickly embraced the partnership between the Lone Ranger and his trusted ally Tonto, played by Jay Silverheels. Together, they represented teamwork, loyalty, and a commitment to justice that resonated with viewers across the country. Children watched the show with excitement, while adults appreciated the moral clarity that defined each episode. In a world still recovering from the hardships of war and economic uncertainty, the Lone Ranger offered a reassuring message that honesty and courage could still prevail. But while the character lived a life of simple heroism on screen, Clayton Moore's experience behind the scenes was far more complicated. The very success that made him famous also created unexpected challenges. Being so closely associated with one role meant that audiences struggled to see him as anything else. Casting directors often hesitated to offer him different parts because the image of the Lone Ranger had become so deeply embedded in the public imagination. For Moore, this meant that the mask which brought him fame also became a symbol of limitation, tying his identity almost entirely to a single character. Despite these obstacles, Moore remained deeply committed to the values that the Lone Ranger represented. Unlike many actors who eventually distanced themselves from their most famous roles, he embraced the character long after the television series ended. He appeared at public events wearing the mask and costume, greeting fans who still saw him as a hero they had admired during childhood. For many people, especially younger fans, meeting Clayton Moore felt like encountering the Lone Ranger himself, a living reminder of the stories that had inspired them years earlier. Yet even this devotion to the character eventually led to conflict. In the 1970s, legal disputes arose over the rights to the Lone Ranger image, leading to a surprising situation in which Moore was temporarily prevented from wearing the mask in public appearances. For someone who had spent decades embodying the character for fans, the restriction felt deeply personal. Determined not to disappoint the audiences who had supported him for so long, Moore found a creative solution by wearing oversized sunglasses instead of the traditional mask, continuing to appear as a Lone Ranger in spirit even when legal rules attempted to limit the image. This moment revealed something important about Clayton Moore's relationship with the role that defined him. For him, the Lone Ranger was never simply a television character. It represented a set of ideals that he genuinely believed in. The character's commitment to honesty, fairness, and protecting those who could not defend themselves became part of Moore's own public identity. Fans who met him often described how sincerely he treated the responsibility of representing those values, particularly when interacting with children who viewed the Lone Ranger as a real-life hero. Beyond the public appearances and legal battles, Moore's life also reflected the quieter realities faced by many actors after their most famous roles fade from television screens. Hollywood can be an unforgiving place where success often arrives suddenly and disappears just as quickly. For performers whose careers become tied to a single character, the challenge of reinventing themselves can be overwhelming. Yet Moore seemed to understand that the impact of the Lone Ranger extended far beyond the typical definition of fame. The character had become part of American cultural history, and Moore accepted that his place within that history would always be linked to the masked rider day as the years passed. Nostalgia for classic television began to grow, and the legacy of the Lone Ranger once again found appreciation among new audiences. Collectors, historians, and longtime fans revisited the series, recognizing its role in shaping early television storytelling. During these later years, Clayton Moore was often invited to conventions and celebrations where fans expressed gratitude for the inspiration his character had provided. These events offered a reminder that even decades after the original broadcast, the values represented by the Lone Ranger still resonated with people seeking heroes who stood for integrity and justice. Looking back now, the life of Clayton Moore reveals a fascinating contrast between fiction and reality. On screen, the Lone Ranger lived a life defined by certainty and moral clarity, always riding away victorious after defeating villains. Off-screen, Moore's journey included professional challenges, legal disputes, and the complex experience of living under the shadow of an iconic role. Yet in many ways, the dedication he showed to honoring the character's ideals mirrored the very heroism that audiences admired in the show today. The story of Clayton Moore serves as a reminder that the people behind legendary characters often carry their own struggles and triumphs far from the camera spotlight. While millions remember the Lone Ranger as a fearless symbol of justice, the real story of the man behind the mask is equally compelling, a tale of perseverance, identity, and the lasting power of a role that shaped television history. And as long as audiences continue to celebrate classic heroes who stood for courage and integrity, the legacy of Clayton Moore and the Lone Ranger will ride on through the memories of those who grew up believing that somewhere out there, a masked rider was always ready to do what was right. As the popularity of Clayton Moore continued to grow during the height of television's golden age, the line between the actor and the character he portrayed began to blur in ways that few performers ever experienced. For millions of viewers, especially children who watched every episode of The Lone Ranger, Moore was not simply playing a hero. He was a Lone Ranger. The mask, the white hat, and the powerful image of a man riding across the frontier on his faithful horse Silver became inseparable from Moore himself. But while the public celebrated the hero they saw on screen, the personal reality behind that image was far more complex and sometimes far more difficult than anyone realized at the time. During the early 1950s, the show had become one of the most recognizable Western programs on television. Families gathered around their television sets to watch the masked lawman and his trusted companion Tonto, portrayed by Jay Silverheels, confront outlaws and protect innocent townspeople. The partnership between the two characters was an important part of the show's appeal, presenting a message of loyalty and cooperation that resonated with audiences across America. Each episode followed a familiar structure. Danger would appear, justice would prevail, and the Lone Ranger would ride away before accepting any reward, leaving behind only a silver bullet as a symbol of fairness and honor. Yet behind the scenes, the life of Clayton Moore was far less predictable than the heroic adventures he portrayed each week. Hollywood during that era was known for demanding schedules and strict studio contracts, and actors often worked long hours under intense pressure. Moore's commitment to the role required physical endurance as well as emotional discipline. Riding horses, performing action scenes, and maintaining the character's calm, confident presence demanded constant focus. Even though the mask hid part of his face, the responsibility of representing such an iconic figure weighed heavily on his shoulders. What made Moore's situation particularly unusual was the way audiences treated him outside the television studio. While many actors enjoy fame for their performances, Moore discovered that fans expected him to embody the Lone Ranger's values even in everyday life. Children would approach him with admiration, believing they were meeting a real-life hero who always stood for truth and justice. Moore understood that these moments carried a special responsibility. Instead of distancing himself from the character, he chose to embrace the role fully, recognizing that the Lone Ranger had become a symbol of hope for many young viewers. However, the very success of the character eventually created challenges that few people anticipated. When the television series ended its original run, Moore hoped to explore new opportunities in film and television. Unfortunately, the power of the Lone Ranger image made it difficult for casting directors to see him in different roles. The mask that had brought him fame had also created a form of typecasting that limited his career options. For an actor with genuine talent and dedication, this situation could be deeply frustrating. Despite these obstacles, Moore remained remarkably loyal to the character that had defined his life. While other performers might have attempted to distance themselves from a single famous role, he did the opposite. He continued appearing at charity events, parades, and public gatherings dressed as a Lone Ranger, often delighting fans who were thrilled to see the legendary hero in person. These appearances helped keep the character alive long after the television series had ended, turning Moore into a living symbol of the bygone era of television storytelling. One of the most dramatic chapters in Moore's story occurred during the 1970s when legal disputes over the rights to the Lone Ranger character reached an unexpected turning point. The company that controlled the character's licensing attempted to prevent Moore from wearing the famous mask during public appearances. For fans, the idea seemed almost unbelievable. After all, Moore had become the face of the Lone Ranger for an entire generation. Yet legal ownership of fictional characters often operates under complicated rules, and the situation placed Moore in a difficult position. Rather than allowing the conflict to end his connection with the role, Moore responded with determination and creativity. Instead of the traditional black mask, he began wearing distinctive sunglasses during his appearances, maintaining the recognizable image of the Lone Ranger while technically avoiding the restrictions placed upon him. The decision quickly became part of entertainment history, demonstrating Moore's commitment to the fans who had supported him for so many years. Eventually, public support and negotiations allowed him to resume wearing the mask, restoring the image that audiences loved. Through these experiences, Clayton Moore revealed something remarkable about his character both on and off screen. The values associated with the Lone Ranger, loyalty, perseverance, and a sense of responsibility toward others, seemed to guide Moore's own decisions throughout his life. Instead of viewing the role as a limitation, he treated it as a legacy that he had been entrusted to carry. In doing so, he preserved the spirit of the character for future generations who continued discovering the show through reruns and nostalgic television programming that as the decades passed. Moore's dedication to the Lone Ranger became a source of admiration among fans and historians alike. Television historians often point to his career as an example of how deeply a character can influence both an actor's identity and the cultural memory of a generation. The Lone Ranger was more than just another Western hero. It was a symbol of moral clarity during a time when audiences valued stories that emphasized honesty and courage. Looking back today, the story of Clayton Moore reveals a complicated relationship between fame and identity. On screen, he represented a fearless hero who never failed to uphold justice. Off-screen, he faced the very human challenges of maintaining a career, navigating legal battles, and defining his own identity within the shadow of an iconic role. Yet through it all, Moore remained committed to the ideals that made the Lone Ranger such a beloved figure in many ways. That commitment ensured that the character would live far beyond the original television series. Even after Moore's passing, the image of the masked rider galloping across the frontier continues to evoke nostalgia and admiration among fans of classic television. And behind that image stands a real story of Clayton Moore, a man who discovered that sometimes the greatest challenge is not becoming a hero on screen, but learning how to carry that hero's legacy in real life as the years went on. The legacy of Clayton Moore only grew stronger, but behind that enduring image was a man whose life had been shaped by triumph, disappointment, loyalty, and an unwavering belief in the character he helped bring to life. Even long after the camera stopped rolling on the Lone Ranger, Moore continued to appear in public wearing the mask that had made him famous. To some observers it seemed unusual, but for Moore it was never about clinging to fame. Instead, it was about honoring a symbol that had inspired generations of children and families. The Lone Ranger represented justice, courage, and a belief that doing the right thing mattered, even when it was difficult. Moore felt a responsibility to keep that spirit alive. Children who met him at parades, charity events, and community gatherings often believed they were meeting the real Lone Ranger, and Moore never shattered that illusion. He understood how powerful heroes could be in a young person's imagination. Parents frequently shared stories about how their children had become fascinated with the adventures of the masked rider and his loyal companion, Tonto, after watching reruns or hearing about the legendary series from older family members. For Moore, these encounters were among the most meaningful parts of his life. Long after Hollywood had moved on to new trends and new stars, he remained committed to the values that the character represented. But Moore's journey had not been easy. Before becoming the face of one of television's most iconic heroes, he had spent years struggling to find consistent work in the film industry. Like many actors of his era, He appeared in smaller roles across numerous productions, slowly building a career in the shadows of bigger names. When the opportunity to portray the Lone Ranger first appeared, it seemed like just another role among many Western projects being produced at the time. No one could have predicted how deeply the character would resonate with audiences or how closely Moore's identity would become tied to the masked lawman. When the show debuted in the early 1950s, television itself was still a relatively new form of entertainment. Families gathered around small black and white screens, eager for stories that brought adventure and excitement into their living rooms. The Lone Ranger quickly captured the public imagination. Each episode followed a familiar formula. Injustice appeared, danger threatened innocent lives, and the mysterious masked rider would arrive just in time to restore order. The thrilling cry of "Hi-yo, Silver!" echoed across the country, becoming one of the most recognizable lines in television history, yet fame can be a complicated thing. While Moore's performance helped define the character, the entertainment industry often treated actors as replaceable pieces of a much larger machine. At one point during the series' production, the role was temporarily given to another actor, a decision that stunned many viewers who had come to see Moore as the only true Lone Ranger. The change created confusion and controversy, reminding Moore that even beloved performers could suddenly find themselves pushed aside. Eventually, he returned to the role, but the experience left a lasting impression about how unpredictable Hollywood could be despite these setbacks. Moore never allowed bitterness to overshadow his appreciation for the opportunity he had been given. In interviews throughout his life, he often spoke with gratitude about the character that had defined his career. He believed the Lone Ranger stood for something bigger than any single actor or television program. The character's message of fairness, responsibility, and courage resonated across generations, especially during a time when the world was undergoing enormous cultural change. Years after the original series ended, Moore continued to receive letters from fans who described how the show had influenced their lives. Some said it had inspired them to pursue careers in law enforcement or public service. Others simply remembered the joy of watching the adventures with their families. These stories reinforced Moore's belief that the Lone Ranger had become more than just entertainment. It had become a symbol of the ideals people hoped to see reflected in the real world. Still, behind the mask was a man who had faced his own share of challenges. Like many performers whose careers became closely associated with a single role, Moore sometimes struggled to find new opportunities in Hollywood. As time passed and new generations discovered the old series through reruns, the legend of the Lone Ranger continued to grow. Historians of television often pointed to the show as one of the defining programs of early American broadcasting. Its combination of Western adventure, moral storytelling, and unforgettable characters helped shape the language of television for decades to come. Moore's portrayal remained at the center of that legacy. Looking back, it becomes clear that Clayton Moore's real story was never simply about playing a famous role. It was about the relationship between an actor and the character that came to define him. While some performers try to distance themselves from their most famous parts, Moore embraces connection to the Lone Ranger.